refuse me. I ask you to accept me for the experiment.
The question of whether chimps and humans could still interbreed today is complex and controversial. While we are very similar genetically, the different number of chromosomes in chimps and humans presents problems.
If a human-ape hybrid were to be produced, I think it would be severely malformed and profoundly retarded. I think you would just get a huge mess. So I would expect this offspring to either not live very long or not even make it to birth.
There are cases where similar animals with a different number of chromosomes have been able to produce offspring, like the mule, a cross male donkey and a female horse, or a liger, the offspring of a male lion and a female tiger. But there are problems with these new hybrids.
It's like shuffling a deck of cards. Sometimes you're going to get a winning hand, sometimes you're going to get a losing hand. Probably most often you're going to get a losing hand.
Even if an ape and human were able to have a child, they might not have a grandchild for the same reason that mules cannot reproduce.
Hypothetically, even if we could produce some sort of human-ape hybrid offspring, it would be infertile. So it would be impossible to start to create a race of them by breeding them with each other.
But Regal disagrees, in theory.
There are a lot of misconceptions about hybridization, and one is that hybrids are always going to be inviable like mules. Mules become the paradigm for hybrids. But that's just a rare example. There are hybrids all over the place, and they're not necessarily inviable. There's no law of hybridization.
And the differences between man and chimps may be smaller than we think.
Many of the same emotions that they feel, we feel. Many of the same thoughts we have, in some ways, they have.
Humanzee and Panbanisha are bonobos, a great ape and cousin of the chimpanzee. They live at the Great Ape Trust of Iowa, a primate research center in Des Moines. This new great ape was first discovered in the wild in Africa in 1928, living in an area surrounded by chimpanzees and gorillas. Bonobos are considered to be among the most intelligent apes in the world, and in many ways the most similar to humans.
Melon? Melon. Thank you.
Compared to chimpanzees, bonobos have a more human-like face and walk upright more often. They also seem to be more willing and able to communicate with us.
The mental abilities that we often look at are language, planning, problem solving, learning, social coordination.
The apes have been in captivity since infancy. They have been taught to communicate in English through a touch screen of unique symbols representing over 350 words.
Batata.
Batata.
Very good.
Part of their abilities is that they have human abilities, and they have those human abilities because they have grown up in a world that has been populated by humans, and their cultural exposure is informed by humanness.
And like other chimpanzees, they are emotional beings.
Whether they're frustrated, whether they're happy, whether they're excited, because they have some of the same facial muscles that we have, and as a result show the same facial expressions that we do. In some ways, they're more human-like than we really realize.
The apes acquire language just as human children acquire language. They acquire it by growing up in a world that uses language.
Cheese. Good. Melon.
Apes learn exactly the same way as humans do.
But they also show we have much more to learn.
We think we are the most intelligent, and that may be the case. I'm just saying that that is a very human-oriented view of what intelligence is. If I went to the Congo, my ability to do calculus or my ability to play the piano or whatever it is I can do that people think is a smart thing that I do would be meaningless there.
Get the grapes out of the backpack if you like. Go ahead. I don't care. it's okay with me if you get the grapes. They're good grapes.
Ivanov is not alone in exploiting the similarities between primates and humans. Medical research has long used primates to further our knowledge of medicine. These experiments are considered justifiable by some and examples of animal cruelty by others.
I have been called Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein.
Dr. Robert White is a world-renowned neurosurgeon. In an effort to find relief for human quadriplegics living inside decaying bodies, he proposed finding a way to transplant a human head onto a brain-dead human body. Dr. White began preliminary experiments on primates in 1970. Viewers are warned that the following footage is graphic. It shows Dr. White's surgery, removing the head of one monkey and putting it on the body of another. Critics might say White's procedure was cruel. White says it was critical in advancing surgical techniques for the brain and spinal cord injuries. He says he could not have done this without his work with monkeys.
We're looking at the same cells, the same fibers, the same arrangements, the same chemical reactions take place in the tissues. The biophysical activity, which comes out the other end, is electrical. The way the cells communicate. So in other words, we've got the same wiring.
Dr. White wanted to verify if he could transplant consciousness.
We figured the only way we could do it was develop an operation so we could transplant the brain inside the skull, still surrounded by the head.
The experiment was a success in that the monkey was able to think and act upon its thoughts, proving to White that its consciousness also moved to the new host body.
The head containing the brain, now connected to the body of another animal, suddenly awakened, became very pugnacious, and in a sense, as far as its mouth and teeth were concerned, very dangerous. And from where our observations of the animal were taking place, he could see, taste, smell, and I want to tell you, bite.
Ethical issues halted Dr. White's experiments in any capacity for good. In fact, nature most likely prevents any future possibility of transplanting the head of a human onto the body of an ape.
The immunological problem here, tissue rejection, would be formidable.
How is head transplantation any different than genetic engineering, other than what we are creating in the labs cannot look back at us or bite, just yet? It is important to know that Ivanov was neither an atheist nor a religious man. He was indifferent. So the metaphysical question is, would he perceive the hybrids as animals or as human beings?
He thought of himself as a serious scientist, and he thought it would be unscientific to speculate about that at this early stage.
So Ivanov moved forward to inseminate woman G with orangutan sperm. At the same time, devastating forces in Russia conspired against him. In 2006, newspapers around the world ran stories of Joseph Stalin's alleged effort to create an ape-man soldier. This man says he has the documents to prove interbreeding efforts were made. This man says an ape woman named Zena lived in Russia 20 years earlier. This man is doing DNA testing of Zena's son, Quit. Ilya Ivanov's attempts to inseminate chimps with human sperm were unsuccessful. Then in 1929, before he could inseminate a Russian woman with orangutan sperm, his plan was derailed when the donor orangutan, Tarzan, died. And for Ivanov, the historic window of opportunity was closing, and Ivanov's experiments were never completed. True to his capricious and opportunistic nature, Stalin by this time had eliminated all of the old-school Bolsheviks, including many prominent scientists. He was on his path of destruction, and what of Ivanov?
and Ivanov was arrested and put into jail.
They were now considered old specialists and were vulnerable to repression and political criticism. 1 year later, in 1932, Ivanov died of a stroke. His personal quest was over. One of the most sensational aspects of the story in the Scotsman newspaper was that Stalin wanted Ivanov to engineer an ape-man soldier. But did he? It seems that what began as a scientific article turned into a science fiction thriller.
I wrote up a little piece about it for the New York Times, and it got published, and I was watching to see, you know, is anybody going to pick up this story? Does the world find this as exciting as I do? And then about 10 days later, there's this even wackier story comes out of a British newspaper, The Scotsman, that this was to do with Stalin wanting to breed a race of super warriors. And what I think must have happened is that my little story in the New York Times got picked up and elaborated and embellished by some Russian newspapers, and then the Scotsman's reporter in Moscow came across those stories and repeated them.
What were Ivanov's real intentions then? Ivanov's records reveal that the intended reason for the experiments was not to create a super warrior after all, but rather to discredit the church by supporting evolution over religious beliefs.
Ivanov expected that these experiments would be a huge step towards establishing the exact human genealogy and should be used in anti-religious propaganda against the religious prejudice.
The Russian church enjoyed huge influence in Russian political life, and Ivanov and his eventual patrons were afraid of persecution from the powerful church. And what of Joseph Stalin's involvement?
I think that Stalin had really nothing to do with the experiments. There is no evidence to support the claim.
The only direct connection to Stalin was a scientific grant awarded to Ivanov, something Stalin had done with many other scientists of the time. In fact, later documents seem to support that Stalin held strong views against interbreeding.
In 1936, an American geneticist, Hermann Muller, came to the Soviet Union and proposed to Stalin a radical eugenic plan. He suggested that the Soviet Union starts the program of the artificial insemination of women with the sperm of outstanding men. Stalin was furious. He vehemently opposed this plan.
Why then was Stalin rumored to be involved, and how did the stories of Stalin's ape man come to be?
People are always interested in dictators, so it would make this story sound more interesting.
And what of Mother Nature? Could she be creating ape men that walk among us? Could Zena be evidence of nature's handiwork? Biologist Kurt Nelson has the DNA results.
Okay, here we have it. The samples are divided into 3 sets. This is the positive control. This is purified human DNA in each case. We got a good strong band so that the purification worked. But what you see is that there's no bands in either the drill powder or the smashed tooth sample in each of the 3 primer cases. So that means that I just failed to get DNA. It's certainly a tooth. There was DNA there at one time. It means that the question of what kind of a creature this was is still up in the air.
While history says apes and man likely interbred millions of years ago, science says it is likely not happening today. At least there is no evidence to prove ape-man hybrids currently exist in nature or in the lab.